So I just have to tell you, I am honored to see all of you. I am a Red Sox fan. And Red Sox fans are probably the only people who fully understand Cubs fans. So, driving over here this evening, I thought, if there are only 5 people, I will get it. This is a very big night, so I'm really thrilled to see you. And I do have to start by telling you how much I love your town. I did start my career here in 1990. I taught at the U of C Law School from 1990 to 1994, and I can tell you, as a career academic, if you want to make clear to some other professor that you are serious, you say, I taught at the University of Chicago. And so my husband and I were married on Promontory Point down in Hyde Park, and then had our reception at the Park Hyatt. And a month ago, I drove the elder of my 2 sons to Northwestern to start in the School of Communications. So I'm planning to be back here often. and I just more than that, I love the town. I love the spirit of the town, the civic spirit, the fact that I always tell people that Chicago is more like Paris than any other city, because it is the city that invests the most in the beauty of its public spaces and thinks about public space and what it is to have that community as a city. I know it's not perfect, I get that, but it's great to be here. So I want to start sort of with a preamble to talk about how this book is different than the article, and then I'm going to go into the major themes of the book, and then we'll have a chance to ask questions. But the most important thing in many ways to know about this book, at least for me, is that 3 years ago I could not have written it. 3 years ago I did not believe what's in it. Not just that I hadn't thought of it, I didn't believe what I now believe. So it's not an extension of the article. It certainly grows out of that experience, but I wrote that article, and no, I had absolutely no idea that it would trigger the reaction it triggered, and neither did anybody else. When a week before it came out, Atlantic Media was trying to get me booked on various TV shows, and many of them were like, oh, not this movie again. The women have been writing this every 10 years for the last 30. And this is a snooze. And what I think happened was that I caught a generational wave. I think mothers sent it to daughters, and daughters sent it to mothers, and lots of other people got caught up in it. But I, of course, got a huge reaction online, but I also got hundreds of direct emails and letters from people I had never met, although some were former students and former colleagues. And because I'd been quite personal, it was astonishing how personal people were to me. I mean, long letters telling me their story, and frequently how they had gotten shut out of a workplace, or how they had had a child with special needs, or if something had happened, and what they had experienced and how important it was to have somebody raising these issues. And then I started giving speeches like this one, and I was reading and thinking. I'd agreed to write a book, mostly to provide a sort of platform to tell those stories. And I would come and I would give a speech, and then afterwards people would ask questions, and I essentially would be revising my own views all along. I also discovered things about my own family that I didn't realize. So right after the article came out, one of my close friends wrote me a note. I grew up in Virginia in the 1960s, and she'd been one of my grade school friends, and she said, your father was really progressive. He raised you to have a career, but my father didn't raise me to have a career, and nobody else's father that we knew raised them to have a career. So why was your dad so progressive? And I realized that, he's my dad. I'd never questioned that. He had always talked to me about having a career. He was a lawyer. I decided I'd be a lawyer very early. But I wrote him an email, and I said, why were you so ahead of your time? And Virginia in the 1960s was not a progressive place. It was basically just barely out of Jim Crow, and women were more or less still to be seen and not heard. He said that this was the first wave of divorce, which was partly the early women's movement, partly the pill, partly social change heading into the 60s. And he said he was a lawyer, and he was representing a number of women who had put their husbands through school, who had then raised their children, who were then in their 50s or 40s, and their husbands had left them, and they had no ability to support themselves. And Dad said he vowed at that point that his daughter would never be in that position. And I tell that story because, you know, I love my dad, and I'd always thought he wanted me to have a career because I was like him, and, you know, he wanted me to achieve my potential. But it showed me a different side of him. It showed me, first of all, a piece of the women's movement I'd read about but not touched. But second, that this was him as a father. You know, it wasn't about ambition. It was about a father who wanted his daughter always to be able to support herself. And I also looked at my mother. You know, before writing this article and then thinking about these issues, I would have told you very quickly my mother is a professional artist. She actually had a show here in Chicago when I was teaching at the law school. And she's a fabulous artist. And I would have told you that very quickly. And I'd have told you she has, you know, paintings and collections. And I would have emphasized her professional credentials. I probably would not have told you she was a homemaker until her kids were pretty much almost in college. And then became a full-time artist. But my parents are now both over 80, and I look at them both. My father's actually still working, so is she. She's painting, and he's still working. But I look at their life's work, and I'm very proud of him as a lawyer, and I'm proud of her as an artist. But I look at her work in addition to her being an artist, and I see my family. And I see my two brothers and our mates and the grandchildren and the aunts and uncles and others. And I think, you know, she laid that foundation. Without that family, I can't do anything that I do. It's not either or. It's both and, right? It's because of that family that she created. And my father was great, but he was working hard, and she was the glue, and she invested. And because of that, we are a family that takes great pleasure in being together and supports each other. And, you know, we've gone through tough times like every family. This isn't the Waltons, but to those of you who might remember the Waltons, I'm showing my age. But at any rate, but my point is that I can now say completely honestly that I look at my parents and I look at my mother's work investing in that family, and I think that's every bit as important as her work as an artist or my father's work as a lawyer. And that I did not believe 3 years ago. So I'm going to start with that in terms of how my own thinking's evolved, and really come to a place I hope other people will come to, but it was a process. The book starts with sort of going over some of the terrain in the article, but it starts with my hitting a tipping point. And I'm going to start right here, right now. I am all for lean in. This is not Sheryl Sandberg versus Anne Marie Slaughter. It never really was. It is true that in the article I said, you know, that her original TED Talk I thought had a note of reproach for women who found themselves unable to lean in. But even then, I praised her in the article, and in the book, I'm very clear to say, as a CEO, I have women who ask me for raises, and when they do, I know they have read Lean In, and I'm sort of torn. On the one hand, I'm like, you go, and as a boss, I can't always say yes, but I can at least always compliment them or praise them for having had the guts to ask. And so I've seen the results of Lean In. I think it is terrific. But when I talk about a tipping point, it's basic physics, right? You cannot lean in too far without a really strong support system, or you will tip over. It's just obvious, right? If you think about it, you know, you think of a tree leaning over a riverbank, you know, or a ballerina being held up. You have to have a support system. And even when you have a great support system, and I had a husband who was willing to be a lead parent back in Princeton while I was in Washington, and I had enough money to have a housekeeper, and I lived in an affluent community where my kids had a great public school like this one. Even so, I hit a tipping point because in the end, my son really needed 2 parents at home, and we didn't know whether that was going to make a difference, but we sure knew we had to try. So if even, you know, I could hit a tipping point with all those advantages, anybody can. It's not a matter of your own ambition or how much you want it. It's a matter of what happens that you don't predict, which is also called living, right? So you have a child, as mine did, who hit a rocky adolescence. You have a child with special needs. Your marriage doesn't hold up. You depend on extended family, and you have to move or they have to move. There are as many different reasons for hitting a tipping point as there are unpredictable life circumstances. And if we think that that's hard for women and men, like all of us, just think about what it's like when you don't have a supportive spouse. You may have no spouse at all, or you don't have not only money to have extra help, you may be the sole caregiver or breadwinner, or you may be just simply trying to hold on. So the second thing that I came to in writing this book was we focus so much on women at the top. And I started there. I said, why aren't there enough women at the top? And Sheryl Sandberg started there, and countless other fabulous scholars have started there, because we're stuck. You know, we made a lot of progress till about 1990, and then we have, 50%, over 50% women outpacing boys in high school and then in college and in graduate school, going into the workforce. And then, of course, as they rise toward top positions, in a good industry, you've got 20% women in senior management, and in a tough industry like finance or tech, you're lucky if you've got 5%. So we're stuck. And that's an important question. But when we ask that question of why don't we have enough women at the top, we immediately just start counting. We look at the Fortune 500 and we say how many women are there. We look at the percentages of partners in law firms and the numbers of surgeons and the numbers of tenured professors, and go Liz on the tenured side. We don't see the equally jarring asymmetry of far too many women at the bottom. But actually, we must look at both. We must see too few women at the top and way too many women at the bottom. Because the majority of minimum wage workers in this country are women, 2/3 of shift workers are women, and the poorest people in this society are overwhelmingly single mothers. They are the ones who are breadwinners and caregivers at the same time. So when we think about a tipping point, and we think about the need, anybody who is giving care, and that can be caring for your children or caring for your parents or for disabled members of your family or ill members of your family, essentially anybody who needs care, and that can be any of us at different times in our lifetimes. We have to think about all the caregivers that applies to, at the top, at the bottom, and frequently many women in the middle class who are just holding on. As Elizabeth Warren writes, one of the best predictors of bankruptcy in this country is a middle-class divorcee, where suddenly she can no longer support her family without her husband, and she has to file for bankruptcy. Okay, so that if we set the stage and think about all women, and think about no matter how much you lean in, and no matter how much you're committed to your career, no matter how much you try to plan, life may not go that way, then how do we frame that problem? And we've been framing it as a women's problem. As I said, we've mostly been framing it as an affluent women's problem, but even taking all women into account, we've been calling it a women's problem. It's not. It is a work problem. It is the problem of a workplace that is still designed for a workforce circa 1960. A Leave It to Beaver workforce where we assume June Cleaver is at home, right? We have a workplace where 60% of women are in the workforce. That number is dropping, but the higher percentage of mothers are in the workforce, although again, that number is dropping because of the cost of childcare. There is nobody home in most of our houses for when those unpredictable rhythms of caregiving arise. When a child is sick, when any number of school activities, when in Chicago you get this, there's the snow day and the schools close and your job stays open. It used to drive me mad as a dean, right? I was a young dean, and my husband was still commuting back to Harvard, and I remember vividly, a snow day, the school's all closed, but Princeton doesn't close. It's a campus. It does not close. And I was the dean, and I had the president of Ireland coming to see me, and I had a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. Like, what are you supposed to do in that setting? Now, I scrambled. I called every undergraduate I knew, and somebody finally came and bailed me out. And if worst had come to worst, I was the dean. I could have taken my kids in. Although you couldn't drive, I was thinking about, leading a sled. But that is a work problem. That is the fact that the workplace has not adapted to the workforce. And here we were talking about design for America. We've got a workplace designed for an America of 50 years ago. And we need to design that workplace for today's America, for women and men who are caregivers. And if they may not be taking care of their children, but many of them are going to be taking care of their parents. I'm the height of the baby boom. I was born in 1958. That means as I age, there were more children born in 1958 than any other year in the baby boom. So as I age, the baby boom becomes an elder boom. And we are going to have to provide care for elders. And then, as I said, for just ordinary circumstance where a relative is ill or disabled, all the ways in which we provide care in extended families. The workplace has to adapt to make room for care. And for those people who are not taking care of others, there's also self-care, right? It's those parts of us that are not work. And generally, that's investing in others. That can be investing in your community, but that can also be investing in your passions. And one of the interesting things in the book talks about the ways in which investing in others is like investing in a work of art or a piece of music or a piece of writing, that it has very similar attributes. So how to make the case to workplaces? They have to adapt. I'm not new, I think, in making this case, except that I think, we women have been too ready to embrace it as an issue primarily for working mothers as opposed to a workplace issue. But I think there are two important arguments to make. One is simply that corporations are wasting their own investment. When we talk about corporate waste, this is a huge waste. You've got, as a CEO myself, you hire people, you train them, you mentor them, you invest in them, and then if they leave, you start all over again, and half the time the person you get is not as good as the person who left. Not to mention the fact if you're mostly losing women, you are losing incredibly important diversity in your workplace. You're becoming, once again, a boys' club in a way that means you're not getting all the valuable diversity of different perspectives, and obviously gender's not the only one. And that is exactly what's happening. Think about it if the other way. Think about it if you had 50% women and 50% men who started in the workplace. But then 20 to 30 years later, there were only 5 to 20% men who were left. All the other men were gone because they left. Well, don't you think most companies would think this is a huge problem, right? We are not retaining our talent. We are investing in people and we are losing them. That's the way it's got to be framed now. That if we don't manage to make room for care, you lose the investment that you start with. And again, this is increasingly going to be men as well as women. As men, 50% of men have reported changing jobs or deferring a promotion for family reasons. Now, corporations rarely see it that way, right? They see it differently when men do it. When mothers do it, they say, oh, that's a family issue. But actually, lots of men are already making these trade-offs, and 56% of women say it is somewhat or very difficult to fit work and life together, and 50% of men do. But the second thing that corporations or workplaces generally, because it's not just business, are missing out on are the attributes that caregiving hones in caregivers. And this is something that honestly, I say in the book that when I read this, it was like a piece of the puzzle finally fitting into place. Andy's aunt sent me a book called On Caring. It was written in 1971 by a male philosopher. And it's part of a series of great philosophers that was published in the early 70s to help people make sense of their rapidly changing world. Sounds familiar. It's a little tiny book written by a man who was a father, but this is 1971. Work-life balance was not a phrase anybody had ever heard. But what he writes about is what you as an individual get when you care for others. And he's writing as a father, but he's also writing, again, as a philosopher. And as I said, he uses the analogy and lots of really, it's very well argued, artists, composers, writers, and how they talk about investing in a creation. And what he points out is that when we compete, we invest in ourselves. I'm all for that. I'm quite competitive. And, it's a good thing. We advance our own goals, and we advance civilization by, forming those goals and pursuing them. But when you invest in someone else, you are watching them flourish, right? And that is also hugely rewarding. I don't have to be a mother to say that. I'm a professor. I spent my life teaching kids and feeling like, well, even if nothing that I write ever lasts, who knows what will become of them? Who knows what they will accomplish? And that process of investing in others is a process in which you have to teach substantive knowledge, you have to guide, you have to support, you have to discipline when things go wrong. You have to sort of enable that person to be able to do something. But equally importantly, you have to step back, right? The hardest part of being a good parent is letting that child, if it's a toddler, take those steps and fall down. If it's a teenager, drive away in your car with your heart in your mouth. Or, as my son did this summer, he went off to Europe with his friend on money he'd earned and took off. You must let the person you're investing in make their own mistakes and learn from them and go on their own. That process, that combination of investing and stepping back, the combination of teaching and patient restraint, that is what makes a great manager. That's what you do as a manager. In fact, if you hold up a parenting manual and a management manual, it's the same thing. It's just different words. One is about empowering your team, and the other is letting your child make his own or her own mistakes. But it's the same process. So caregivers, it hones a kind of honesty. It certainly hones humility. People say something, occasionally when I meet people say, well, you seem very down to earth. And I say, yes, I have 2 teenage sons. It is impossible to have a swelled head if you have 2 teenage sons. They are only too happy to tell me all of my various deficits. It hones, as I said, patience and restraint. It hones adaptability to changing rhythms, which is all about, the workplace today. You can't plan, you have to adapt, you have to make do, you have to innovate. What else is parenting? Or frankly, if you're caring for elders, which I've had less experience doing. But again, things are unpredictable, things happen on different rhythms, and you have to make do. So the other place that our workplaces are seriously missing out is all those attributes that caregiving hones. And that either you have people who are working with you who are doing this while they're working and caregiving at the same time, or there are people, and right now there's an entire pool of really talented women between the ages of 50 and 60 who have got 10 to 15 to 20 years more of work in them, and we just don't have the eyes to see what talent is there. And their original talents have now been honed by caregiving. Not to mention the fact many can run a ship as tight as any in the Navy and are logistical whizzes. But it's a deeper point. So that's the second thing to think about as a workplace issue. So if we think about tipping points and we think about defining this as a work issue, not a women's issue, then I want to talk about how else to think about this cluster of questions and what we can do about it. So the third point is, it's not just a women's issue, it's not just a work issue, it is a man's issue. This was the other place that when I wrote that article, I really did think this is about women. And lots of men wrote to me. Not as many women as women who wrote to me, but I'd say 20% men wrote to me. And they all more or less said the same thing, which is, you think I have it all. And mind you, you notice I'm not using the phrase have it all. I'd like to just put that somewhere and tamp it down and never use it ever again. But these men said, I would much rather spend more time with my children. I would like to go to my son's baseball game. I would like to be able to take them on school trips. I would like to be with my children and part of my family in the same way my wife is, but this is not an option for me. I have to be the breadwinner. And if I try to have a better balance, if I try to work part-time, if I try to work flexibly, not only will I be told I'm not committed to my career, I will be told I'm not really a guy. My masculinity will be called into question. We have to tackle this part of the problem, because women are not going to be equal until men are equal. You cannot change women's roles as dramatically as we have and leave men's roles the same. And again, about a year ago, I was looking at our two sons, then 16 and 18, and I looked at them and I thought, if I had a daughter, I'd be raising her completely differently than my mother was raised. Because my mother was of the generation who was told she shouldn't go to med school because she was going to get married, and what was the point of investing in her medical education? But if I had a daughter, I'd be raising her to be a doctor or a scientist or whatever she wanted to be, but I'd also be raising her to be a caregiver. I'd be telling her how fabulous it is to be a mother and a daughter and a sister and a wife. But my sons are being raised the same way my father was raised. They're not now, since I had this epiphany, but our sons are being raised to be breadwinners. We have not changed the roles open to men. Even the most feminist women among us, we tend to raise our sons. We may teach them how to load a dishwasher and cook, but we still basically think their role is going to be a breadwinner. We do not think of them as being lead parents. We do not think of them as supporting their wives with care rather than cash. We still assume they may do some care on the side, but their primary role is to be breadwinners. And it cannot work that way. It can't work that way for obvious reasons, that every man in a really big job, all those male CEOs, all those male senators, the presidents, every man in a big job has if he has a family, he either now has another man supporting him, or traditionally he has had a woman who's lead parent. In fact, we can't imagine asking a male CEO if he's the lead parent or the primary caregiver. It's preposterous. How could he be? But we still somehow expect that women are going to make it to those same positions and somehow also manage their households. They're not. They need a lead parent at home in the same way. And when I was at the Most Powerful Women's Summit 2 years ago, I asked the women in the audience who had a leading man at home. I can't remember how I framed it. I didn't use lead parent. And over 60% raised their hands, and I think it's higher than that. Their husbands are consulting, or maybe they're writing, or some are full-time at home, but they are the ones, if they have families, and not all do, or have children, I shouldn't say have families, but they, of course, then have a lead parent husband. So if we're going to advance women equally to men, then we've got to make it totally acceptable and praiseworthy for men to support women the way women support men. Last part I would say about that is men are also missing out. Right? I mean, there's a reason that as women, when we wanted to have careers, we didn't want to give up family. I wasn't a particularly maternal person. I actually refused to learn to cook, to iron, to sew, to do anything domestic, right? I really did. I was always pretty focused on work. But, I did always assume that someday I'd have children, and I certainly thought, when I looked at my mother and the relationship she had with us, I thought that was pretty wonderful. We wanted both. Well, why don't we think men want both? Right? I mean, one guy wrote to me and he said, I want both every bit as much as you do. I bet you don't believe me, he wrote. He said, I bet as a woman you're thinking, well, maybe you do, but no other guys I do. And he said, that's what men thought about women in the 50s and the 60s. Men thought women didn't want to compete. Women loved being the nurturing types at home. That was what they wanted. That was what men said. But of course, for many of us, that wasn't true. So why do we presume to know what men actually want? If you widened Scope of possibilities for a man, don't you think that they'd want to be, the fathers for their kids in the same way we want to be the mothers for their kids, or the sons for their parents in the same way we want to be the daughters for our parents? They'll do it differently, and we can come back to that. They will definitely do it differently. I'm not suggesting they want to parent exactly like we do, but do they want to have that same role in their families' lives? There's only one way to find out, and that is to make that completely an equal and valued choice. All right, a couple more points. So I've said it's a workplace issue, and I should say one more thing on the workplace issue. Well, let me come back to it. A workplace issue, it's a man's issue, it's a couple's issue. One of the things that some readers have told me is a fairly terrifying part of the book. It wasn't intended to be terrifying, but it's a set of questions that young people should be asking each other as they start out together, both working and thinking about a family. Because my husband and I graduated in the mid-'80s and from graduate school, and everybody, at that point, it was most of our friends, men and women, were both working, and they all said they were going to support each other's careers. We believed in equality. And 20 years later, I am the only one I know of all of our friends where I'm the primary breadwinner and Andy's the lead parent. And in every other case, when somebody had to make a trade-off, it ended up being the woman. And that may have been by choice. I think some of the time it wasn't by choice, but somebody had to make a trade-off, and it wasn't going to be the guy. So couples have to ask each other questions that are more than, will you support my career? Because the answer is always yes. You have to ask questions like, if I get a promotion, will you move for me? That's what happens, right? If you've got a big career, particularly in the corporate sector, you may get moved all over the place. Marilyn Hewson, who is the head of Lockheed, moved 12 times, or maybe 8 times in 12 years. Many people move. Or if I get a big promotion and I have to travel a lot, will you defer yours? Those are the kinds of questions that we need to ask. And again, we need to think about careers differently in ways that both men and women can have those periods. And then one more point on the workplace issue. There's a great deal we need to do for women at the bottom, and I'm going to come to that in a minute. But the other thing that we need to do in workplaces where you need to make room for care, you have to allow workers far more flexible schedules and far more flexible schedules over the arc of a career. It's not just about coming in early, coming in late, or leaving early, or working from home. It's also saying, I need to take these 2, 3, 5 years where I am really working either part-time, or maybe if instead of in a client-facing job, in a corporate job, in a more predictable job. But when I'm ready, you got to let me ramp back up. You need those kind of flexibility policies, but you also have to fight flexibility stigma. Because this is what's holding, it's not that a lot of people can't, at least at our level of income, it's not that you can't take advantage of these policies. It's that when you do, you just cut your own career throat. You just essentially took yourself off leadership track. Because the assumption is still, unless you're going hard all the time and unless you're going straight up, you are not leadership material. You are not a player. And that's just stupid. It's just silly. Right? I mean, when you're ready, your work should be judged based on the quality of the work. And I don't care if you're 35 or 40 or 45 or 50. If you've got what it takes to be promoted, you should be promoted. And if you've got what it takes to be promoted, the next one over that, you should still be promoted. If Hillary wins, she'll be 70, and she had her entire career on her own after Chelsea went to college. And Janet Yellen is 67. Madeleine Albright had her whole career after her kids were out of the house. And women live a long time, and as long as they've got the energy to do it, they should not be stigmatized, nor men. All right, the last piece of this sort of mosaic, really, is that we cannot make these changes alone. Right? It is so tempting, and this is where I understand the appeal of Lean In, and I don't like being the person that says, actually it's really hard, and you might not be able to do it. That is not It's not a very good American role to play. But we just cannot do this one woman, one CEO, one company at a time. We have got to come together as voters and do what we actually tried to do in the 1970s, right? In 1971, a bipartisan majority passed universal daycare in Congress. It's hard to believe, a bipartisan majority for anything passed, you know, and Richard Nixon vetoed it, and we've been going backwards on some of those issues ever since. We have to have paid leave, and it's gonna have to be the government. Because if the government does not mandate paid leave, then good companies simply get undercut by bad companies. And ditto with maternity and paternity leave. Here we can actually learn from our advanced industrial peers and require the same amount of paternity as maternity leave. One of the things that does is it lets men bond with their children really early and become just as competent as mom. And competence is a big part of it, right? If the mother is the one who understands how to do it, he's going to be helping forever. If he is there from the beginning, and I watched this in our own marriage, he's just as good as you are, and he then feels just as invested as you do. So we've got to have maternity and paternity leave, and we have to have whatever it takes, subsidies, centrally provided care, market solutions, this is both and, but access to quality child care and elder care. This is not a women's issue, a parent's issue, a caregiver's issue. This is a competitiveness issue and a national security issue. Because we now know, and New America does a lot of work on early education, we know the neuroscience of the first 5 years says we are not just teaching kids things. We're not just teaching them their ABC and their numbers. We are shaping their brains in a way that will determine what they will be able to learn for the rest of their lives. That is vital for the future of this country. If we do not invest in the kind of high quality care for all of our children, not only are we baking in the achievement gap for generations to come, but we're not going to have kids who are going to actually be able to compete in the global workplace that they're going to have to compete in. And the place that gets this is why I call it a national security issue, is the Pentagon. The Pentagon has on-site daycare, and they pay their early education teachers, otherwise known as daycare providers, they pay their early education teachers the same as they pay their elementary and secondary teachers, based on level of education, level of training. So they have those differences, but nothing on the fact that they teach younger children rather than older children. This is a national issue. So where I would leave you is we do have to do this as citizens. We have to do this as individuals in our relationships with our own families. We have to do this as employees, men as well as women. And we have to do this as voters. We have to say, look, we need an infrastructure of care. We have to recognize that care is an equal and important human activity without which none of us can thrive. And since women are no longer women at home are no longer our infrastructure of care, we're going to have to provide one in many different ways. We will be far happier as a people. We will be far more productive and creative as a people if we actually have room to do this instead of cramming it around ever more frenzied work lives. And we will be a stronger and more competitive and healthier nation. So with that, I hope you will still read the book. There's lots more in it than I just gave you the overview, but I would be happy to open this up to questions on anything I said or anything else that's on your mind. Thank you very much.